Miniszter úrnak a megnyitóját, és úgy értesültem róla, hogy önnek esetleg más elfoglaltságai is vannak, amikor úgy érzi, hogy elfogyott az idő. Köszönjük szépen a részvételét, és hogy itt volt közöttünk. A következő előadó, és ez már egy előadás, már nem a megnyitó, ugye a Habsburg-Lotaringiai háznak a feje, Habsburg Otto fia, 4. Károly unokája, Habsburg Károly lesz. Rengeteg pozíciója van, rengeteg elfoglaltsága van, úgy tudjuk. Nagyon köszönjük, hogy ma ide tudott érkezni, most is úgy tudom, hogy messziről jött, távol-keletről. És ennek kapcsán én csak egyetlen egy számomra nagyon fontos pozícióját szeretném kiemelni, azt, hogy egy olyan nemzetközi szervezetnek az elnöke is, ami védi azt, ami a miénk, az egész világé. És ezek nem más, mint a kulturális kincsek védelme, mert Habsburg Károly az Association of National Committees of the Blue Shield-nek az elnöke. Ez az a szervezet, ami a háborúk és a terrorizmus sújtotta területeken véletlenül vagy szándékosan, és ez brutális hangzik, hogy szándékosan semmisítenek műkincseket, ezeket védik, ezeket próbálják a világnak, a jövőnek megőrizni. Ugye sokszor elcsépeltük már ezt, hogy a múltban van a jövő, igen, abban van, és a Blue Shield kiterjesztette a területét arra is, ahol természetvédelmi katasztrófák által tűnnek el, vagy semmisülnek meg tárgyak. Úgyhogy ezeknek a védelmét is csinálják, és ezért nagyon szépen köszönöm az ő munkáját, mert ez a világnak a teremtése. Kérem, hogy tartsa meg az előadását.
Your Excellencies, dear Minister, Director General, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for organizing today's conference, because I think we have had many commemorative events, I would call them, since 2014 to talk about the history and whatever we can learn, how we can commemorate, what we can see in the history that our European continent went through in the events of the First World War. And today's conference is actually dealing with one of those events that was probably one of those most defining moments, especially whatever considered the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because of course we have to say that the death of Emperor Franz Joseph was an incredibly defining moment, since he was determining the fate of a big empire and a kingdom over several generations. He was determining the picture for many people that were born under him, that made their career under him, and that actually died still during his lifetime. And he was followed by a young emperor who came in with a lot of new ideas, who came in a situation where he could not follow a fixed plan, where he was not working with a cabinet that was at his disposal at the time, like it was, for example, at the disposal of, let's say, the successor Franz Ferdinand. He had a cabinet working with him. My grandfather, Archduke Karl, in his position as successor to the throne, did not have a cabinet in the beginning to work with, and who came in with a conviction that he was reaching the rule of a huge empire in a situation during a war where most of the Axis powers in the war thought that they were going to win the war. And he was convinced that this was not possible. He was convinced, contrary to his own military personnel, to many politicians around him, but particularly contrary to the partners, the other countries partnering with him in that war, that this war could be won outright. So you could see there was a huge break in the middle of the war when it came to the question of the leadership of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was an incredibly determining moment, And I think it is very valuable and very good that we have the conference today to look back at that part of history and to see what we can actually learn from it. What can we learn from our situation for today? I am not a historian. I always have to say this. I am an interested layperson who has been in the privileged position that he was able to speak with a lot of people that were still witnesses at the time of the First World War, that could see those changes in our continent. But as such, for me, history is the only teacher that we have for our future, how to determine our future. And that's why I think it is so crucially important to analyze our history and see that we can avoid the faults we have done in the past and to see how we can actually create a better future. When I was starting to talk about the determining factor of this change in rule, of this change in personnel, in leading personnel in the First World War, then of course we have to see in which situation the Emperor and King Karl was left with after the death of Franz Joseph. And I think one of the most important factors is Franz Joseph had, I would say, a propaganda machine working for him over decades. He was omnipresent. He was picture-wise in every household over the empire. He was in every mayor's office, in every post office. He was very present. Emperor Karl, to the contrary, did not have the privilege of that type of a propaganda. Actually, by the time he came to power, he had a lot of propaganda working against him. Propaganda from the enemy, as well as also propaganda from the own partners in the own war effort. So he had a completely different situation. He was confronted with a lot of reforms that had been started in the time before the First World War, and it was not able to achieve a binding together, a getting a progress together of those type of reforms. And he was confronted with that during a war effort where he was, in many cases, not capable of bringing these reforms to a fruitful conclusion. So he came into this extremely difficult situation where a lot of the elements of the war were driven by emotion. And that's why I really, at that stage, want to thank the Director General specifically for the exhibition that has been created here and that we had the possibility to visit before coming to this conference. Because I think what this exhibition does at the absolute best is recreating the emotion, the feeling that existed probably just before and during the beginning and in the course of the war. A war that was driven in a way that at the beginning of the war, none of the leaders was able to have the view and the perspective to which terrible result a war like this could actually lead. It was driven by an emotion where many people said, okay, the conflict is unavoidable, let's have a quick, fast conflict and let's be home as soon as possible. This was all emotion-driven. And to show this emotion was something that this exhibition is really capturing in the most admirable way, in the most fantastic way. And I would probably also like, in what I can say here, go a little bit deeper into the question of this emotion and into the question of what was the feeling at the time and what is the feeling that we are actually experiencing today. Because, as some of you know, and I'm very grateful for the introduction, I was a member of the European Parliament and I was always extremely close to European development because we can, of course, see a continuity that is happening over the centuries and up to all the efforts that we are seeing today with the European Union. And I think sometimes the parallels that I feel that I can see between the situation in which the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in the time before the First World War and the situation in which the European Union is experiencing today, in which it is today, are quite often very striking, and that's why I will probably take the advantage and talk a little bit about these comparisons that we can see here. I was talking about emotions. Of course, when I had to participate in many events commemorating events from the First World War, I was trying to read up some of those books that we are all familiar with, for example, of Josef Roth, the Radetzky March, these type of literature that captures really the emotion of the time. And when you see there where he is describing in this literary masterpiece, for example, how the Count Chojnicki is having a discussion with an officer where he is going like, everything is bad and we can't really develop anymore. Everybody is in revolt. This was before the First World War. Everybody is planning revolt. Everything is going stagnating. We don't really know where we are moving to. Very often when I'm reading these type of emotions or feelings, it is something I see and can feel very much when I'm looking actually at our European Union today and how people are looking at this European Union of today. There are very many interesting parallels. Of course, you cannot directly compare the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or let's say the old Habsburg Empire of 1526, with today's European Union, but the parallels are striking. I think both have a very complex international construction with the goal to create security and wealth for all the people concerned. They both wanted to abolish borders, and they both wanted to turn over means, of course, monetary means, at the same time, as a means to generate wealth for the population. The Habsburg Empire had a very well-functioning internal market as a means of political collaboration. Every nation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire had their own arrangement with Vienna, in the same way as every member state today of the European Union have their own arrangement with Brussels. The empire had a very well-developed bureaucracy, as has the European Union, as we know, although today, of course, it is much more centralized. The European Union is today considered as an institution that has a ginormous bureaucracy. The big difference compared to the bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is, of course, that at the time of the empire, the bureaucracy was distributed all over the country. It was present in every single mayor's office, post office. It was everywhere there and centrally paid, whereas today's European Union bureaucracy is mainly fixated to 2 or 3 places like Brussels and Strasbourg and Luxembourg. In the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a lot of the civil servants of this very strong civil service were highly specialized. And I'm getting back to Josef Roth, who always took the example of the civil servant who was the specialist for measures and weights that he lets come to word all the time. And in the same way as when you look into the European Union today, you find all those civil servants that are only specialized in, let's say, the internal market or collaboration between some of the member states. There are further, I would say, very striking comparisons between the European Union and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And one that really strikes me is when I'm looking into the development of both is the fact that on one side, one thing that was absolutely clear to the empire and to my ancestors was that they hated war. They despised war for a very good reason. They didn't win too many of those, so they had a very good reason to dislike them. They also didn't have the high development and the training situation of the military that they could achieve too much with it. So they knew that they have to find their gains in other means than war. And if you look into the European Union of today, you will find that the European Union of today exists because of the traumatic experiences of the First and the Second World War. So in this case, also it was the fear of war, the thriving for peace, the thriving for creating a territory of security and stability that was leading in both cases actually to the creation of the big empire, and a lot of elements are speaking for that. If we are just looking at the mottos that happened at the time, you know, the Bella Gerant Alii to Felix Austria Nube, and these sort of mottos that were clearly an example of how this fear of war was actually driving the running of the state. Of course, there are also big differences. I mean, I could go in much more detail here about the comparisons, but of course there are also many big differences between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the European Union. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was actually a state, and the European Union is not a state. It is a construction which is a constructio sui generis. It cannot really be defined clearly whether it's a federation or a confederation, and even the German Constitutional Court was trying to give it a completely new name, which I think also doesn't work, but it's not really a state. And that, of course, determines that the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a state had a clear defined army and a clear defined foreign and security policy, which the European Union today, alas, does not really have. And as I mentioned before, the bureaucracy was also an element where the difference in bureaucracy actually pointed out to the element that today it is very centralized. In the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was also centralized because they were centrally paid, but they were distributed all over the empire, and they were not just fixed to a couple of places, which created in itself a great identification with the state. If you have a directly paid representative of the state in your village down to the lowest level, it creates a complete different element of identification than when the civil servants you are dealing with are only sitting in 2 or 3 places in centers, in this case of Europe, let's say in Brussels or in Strasbourg or Luxembourg. One element that I think is a great comparison of the time before the First World War and what we see today is the fact that there was a general, I would say almost a negative feeling about the construction in question. I mentioned before some of the feelings that came as being expressed, feelings of depression in the time before the First World War. The feeling a period would be going to an end. And we can actually see the same thing today if we look into the European Union and we see how many people have negative feelings about that construction. They are voicing those feelings about the construction because they have feeling that they are coming into an end where the development is not taking the speed they would actually like to have it. Of course, there are a lot of problems and there are a lot of reasons why we might be depressed about this organization. I'm a passionate European, that's why I'm a very critical European, and I see the faults that the institutions have in a very strong way. But the comparison, if you allow me to draw this again, is of course the fact that when you look at the development of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War, it was actually not giving that much of a reason to be that depressed. I mean, the development was actually a fairly good development over the decades before the First World War. There was a very strong progress in the economic field. One has to say there was a strong progress in communication and transport. The infrastructure was growing a lot. The education was progressing in a tremendous way. There was the schooling system was progressing in a strong way. Then, of course, also the element of social means, of health questions, all this was progressing in a very strong way, which had, of course, also a side effect that because this progress actually existed, there was a great demand, and in very many cases, of course, also a very valid demand, that the members of the state, that the different civilians in the state expected a lot from the state in the point of view of creating more in question of election rights, in the question of creating unions or elements like this. This was a logical aspect that was coming with the strong development and the strong progress we could see in the time before the First World War. And of course, at that stage, there was Emperor Franz Joseph. He had a certain age. He was listening to the complaints. He was reacting. And he was reacting very slow. That's why I'm talking also very slow. So a lot of the developments that happened in the time before the First World War were actually not coming to a conclusion. There were raised expectations that could not be fulfilled anymore when the First World War actually started. The expectations were very high, but the decision-making, the positions that would make the decisions were of course taken over by military and not that much anymore by the civil servants with the beginning of the war. All the efforts were directed towards the war. They were not necessarily directed towards fulfilling the reforms that have been started in a time of relative wealth, of development, of a great progress that actually happened in the time before. Now allow me again a little bit to make the comparison to today. We have seen a huge progress in the European Union. We have seen a great collaboration. We have seen an enlargement that for many people was going much too fast in many different directions. But suddenly we don't feel the dynamic of the European Union anymore. It always reminds me a little bit, you know, I have been in the military a pilot, and the nicest moment in flying is when you take off because you feel the speed. When you're up on level, you're flying the fastest, but you don't feel the speed anymore. And that's the same with political development. In the beginning, when a political development, when progress starts, you feel the speed, you feel the emotion, you feel the way how things are moving forward. There's a great positive emotion there. And then suddenly when things start to move smooth and fast, you don't feel them anymore, and the emotion goes away, although things are moving fast. And that is something we were able to see before the First World War, and that's something we are able to see now in the European Union. When I was mentioning before that one of the big problems in the time before the First World War was the fact that very many of the heads of state were not able to see that a conflict of that size, of that tremendous outcome, with these millions of deaths, with these horrors of a war, would actually come and take hold of a continent like Europe. I really hope, and that's why I think it's so important to learn from history, that our politicians today, and I know it for sure in that country, that they have the ability to have the outlook on what is happening east, what is happening west, how the development of Europe is actually going, where we have the need to progress also in the structures of the European Union, where we have the need to progress to create more, let's say, European feeling, and where we have the need to create more the feeling of patriotism, the love for your own country, the defense for your own country and your own people. It's a very difficult balance to find, but it's necessary. And that is something we have to learn as an experience from the First World War. And one last sentence should be allowed to me to say at that stage. It was mentioned before by the minister, and I'm very glad he did that. And that is the important role that actually Central Europe or Middle Europa can actually play in this context. When I'm looking at the development of Europe today, many people say it is too big. I don't see it so. I think we are an element of security, so we need the size. But we have to know that there are certain natural territories and areas that have worked together in history and that should also find their future in working together. And for me, Middle Europa is a classical example of that territory that should work together, that can work together. And allow me to say, as much as I like the institution of the Visegrad states, it is not enough. It should be bigger. There are elements missing to the Visegrad states. It should be bigger to define that Middle Europa, that Central Europe that we have seen working in the history, bringing their culture together, bringing their development together, being successful in this collaboration, to be today, play a new driving role, an important role in the Europe of tomorrow. I think in this sense, we have a historic role to play. We are here in Budapest. We have, from this place, with this outlook that we are having with today's conference, we have a historic role to play. The title is The Last Monarch of the Old World. It looks very much like the end of a period. I am accepting that a period ends, but ideas don't end. We have a common European idea, we have a common European future, and I'm sure that today's conference is a great help to help us for a common European understanding, to learn from the past and to bring the positive ideas into the future. Thank you very much.